Recent events have brought it to my attention that niggas don't know what capitalism is or how it works. Further, I also recently made a video talking about black conservatism, and I said this: black conservatives do not deserve to be put on the same playing field of even an Amanda Seals. They do not represent a viable political ideology worthy of serious attention, and they never will. Both of these things are things I've talked about before in videos, namely the two black conservatism videos I made on my main channel, which is FD Signifier, for those who might be new here for this video for unknown reasons. But even though those are collectively around like 3 hours long, they still don't cover everything about capitalism or black conservatism. In reality, they're just arguing for rejection as what I see as black conservatism and capitalism, but they don't spend a lot of time explaining why those two ideologies persist among black people and why they must be contended with and ultimately rejected by black people in pursuit of liberation. Before we go any further, I want to point out that those are main channel videos and this is the B-sides. And on the B-sides, this is a lot of hot takes. This is not a lot of research. I probably spent more time working on this than I would a typical B-sides video because I wanted to make sure certain things were clear. None of my videos are the end-all be-alls on any topic. This is mostly done through my own previous readings and education and research on this topic over the course of the last few years or maybe even decades. So I stand on my right to change my mind. I stand corrected when that's necessary. Feel free to let me know what I missed or what I got wrong in the comment section. Cool? Cool. Let's do the easy part first. It is an extremely low-level argument to say that capitalism equals having money or pursuing money. Capitalism is not financial currency. It's not the same thing. I am so disappointed in some of y'all. You are not a capitalist for having a job or even a well-paying job. You're not necessarily a capitalist for running a business or even being rich off your work and labor. Now, there are levels of wealth that are only possible with capitalism, and there are many ethical issues one might encounter when pursuing wealth or running a business. And there are so many complicated elements of egalitarianism and left-leaning ways that you might run a business and workers' cooperatives and all kinds of stuff that I'm not going to get into. Maybe I'll leave a video or two that gets into that stuff specifically, but it needs to be understood that the state of having a lot of currency that you were paid due to your job does not make you a capitalist. Pursuing that currency because we live in a society where it's required to have currency to pay for life does not make you a capitalist. It makes you a prisoner of the capitalist system and you're just playing your role in it because you have to. Again, a lot of gobbledygook that I'm skipping, but I'm keeping things simple for a reason. I want to be clear that anyone that tries to defend capitalism or critique socialism or communism or Marxism or any other leftist theory by pointing out that you need money and have a job is themselves repeating CIA talking points. So no, I'm not turning monetization off on this video or my channel. This is my job. I do not work for free. Join my Patreon. It does have a $10 level if you want to support. I want to start there because these are some of the arguments that I hear from my own people sometimes when I say I'm an anti-capitalist, and broadly, they work because this country has done an amazing job of distorting what capitalism is and what it means to be anti-capitalist. I don't even have to say that I'm a socialist or a communist or an anarchist or anything else. All I have to do is dare to criticize capitalism, and some niggas will start talking about capitalism the same way they talk about Derrick Rose before he hurt his knee. And the question I want to answer with this video is why? Why is being critical of black capitalism so radical, especially consider that pretty much every major black political figure that we like to hang up posters of and have celebrated as luminaries up until the 80s and 90s, hint, hint, this will come up later, was incessantly critical of capitalism and understood that it needed to be destroyed in order for black people to be free. I'm not saying they were all communists. I'm not saying they were all Marxist Leninists, though some of them were, but they were at least anti-capitalists, almost all of them. And we repeat their words and they got movies made after them. We dress our kids up like them every February, but we don't engage with their actual philosophies. How did that happen? And here's where I circle back to the concept of black conservatives. And also I'm going to do some, again, grounded theory, meaning like this is me extrapolating stuff based on my own reading. This is not explicitly something I got from elsewhere. Let's make sure we first understand the historical difference between white and black conservatism, or maybe it's just best to say conservatism and black conservatism. And yes, that distinction is important. To put it simply, white conservatism, or conservatism in the West in its current reality and history, is based in capitalism, white supremacy, imperialism, among other things. White conservatism in America is literal in its name. It is seeking to conserve or go back to a way of life in which white people were not just clearly at the top of the social hierarchy, as they obviously still are today, but that same hierarchical structure was explicitly endorsed by law. Landmark legal cases and laws like the Civil Rights Movement, anti-lynching laws, Loving versus Virginia, Brown versus the Board of Education, and so many others eroded some of this state-endorsed white supremacy. And when you hear white conservatives over time and even today say stuff like activist judges, states' rights, liberalism and wokeism is going too far, etc., what they're really getting at is, how do we get back to that pure, uncut white supremacy we had up until the 1950s, where most systemic forms of racism were explicitly endorsed by law? Black Republicans and conservatives like Candace Owens, Jesse Lee Peterson, etc., mostly just act as useful idiots and puppets for this white supremacist political project, believing that they will somehow be exempt from the end results of what white conservatives are seeking. Or I really think like Candace and Jesse Lee in particular, and a couple of these other folks, kind of just want to see us die. They have like this weird apocalyptic thing I think they're doing. When these folks step out of line, they get put down. My favorite new example of this is what's happened to Glenn Loury in the last year or so. Glenn Loury is maybe the most decent, good example of this group, and he was fired from the Manhattan Institute, a conservative think tank, for daring to be critical of Israel as they perform a genocide in Gaza. Now, Glenn, I've heard, is at least heading back to a more traditional form of black conservatism these days after being shown the door, so good for him, I guess. But any black person to the right of Glenn Loury is not to be taken seriously. And as I stated before, these types of conservatives who are black are a statistically insignificant political population, but I went over that in the last video. Moving on. What I want to theorize for this video is that black political thought in America right now, especially in mainstream media, is dominated by black capitalist / conservative thought. And that looks really different from what I just finished mentioning, to the point where calling them conservatives is often met with confusion. And I get it, because the implication is that these folks are Uncle Toms like the Hodge twins or Officer Tatum or Candace Owens. But no, these folks are different, and I don't think they're Uncle Toms. Let me be clear here, because I've been around long enough to know that some of you watching will also be washing the dishes or doing something else and not fully paying attention. What I am theorizing is that we have two different groups: conservatives and real black conservatives who are coming from a tradition within black history and black political thought that, while I don't agree with and is fundamentally wrong and has been proven wrong through history, does at least need to be seriously engaged with. But because of the nature of that word conservative, they probably would reject being called that. And where I want to start with is that regardless of how these black conservatives that I'm speaking of here, the ones that are real and worthy of discussion, regardless of how I feel about the ideas, I believe that this other group of black conservatives is fundamentally pro-black and desire black liberation, even if it's a flawed and, let's be honest, ineffective and unreal version of it that will never happen through the means and strategies that they're presenting. But in fact, historically, this group has been willing to pursue black liberation through radical and aggressive means at times. One example of this that I gotta thank Lil Bill for by way of the book We Will Shoot Back is T.R.M. Howard. T.R.M. Howard was a pro-black, pro-capitalist figure that was also pro-blicky. And unlike most of his contemporaries, staunchly anti-left and anti-communist. He was greatly about black business and community organizing, and he was a mentor to the likes of Medgar Evers and Fannie Lou Hamer. And when Emmett Till was murdered in Mississippi, he was in a position to do something about it, and he organized an independent investigation and armed his people to the teeth and led a caravan of gun-toting Negroes in trucks from Mississippi to Chicago to seek justice. So for him, being anti-left and being conservative didn't mean being anti-black. And I don't think he would have called himself a conservative by today's standards, nor would he have hung out with the modern brigade that we see in conservative media today. However, I can imagine him finding synergy with the likes of Roland Martin, Bois Watkins, and other black leadership figures who focus on racial uplift, black entrepreneurship, and buying power as tools of liberation. In other words, he'd have probably been the modern black liberal, minus the whole armed and dangerous part. And this is because the idea that black people could achieve an entrepreneur and economy their way to freedom is not new. It's just newly prominent. And if you're one of my more moderate viewers, you're probably thinking to yourself, high black achievement and black excellence and black business doesn't sound so bad or outlandish. Why are you against it? I'm not. And most people are not. The problem is the role that is playing in the idea of what black politics and black leadership and black liberation looks like. There was a time when black leadership was far more critical of capitalism and far less invested in the myth of black excellence and black buying power. There was a time when everyone from the more moderate folks to the more real radicals were denouncing the idea that black people should be attempting to recreate the same structures white America kept us under. And you would think the black radical tradition would help balance that out over time, but this is why I'm always critical of folks like Umar Johnson, who turned that black radical imagery and ideology into a farce and ended up having the exact same political outlook as his multi-millionaire friends. And I want to engage that first from the legitimate tree that this comes from, not all the CIA nonsense that sometimes ends up being put back into the atmosphere when people get pressed about their beliefs, but the parts of it that at a time were inherently pro-black and valuable for black liberation. And to do that, we have to look at the core figure in modern black conservative history, Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington is the quintessential black conservative and the best that that term has to offer. He emphasized all those things I mentioned a second ago. He also emphasized not directly engaging with or agitating white supremacist structures in favor of building black institutions up separately. He was a big fan of black business, and he had a less radical, more gradual framework for liberation. He wanted to build up black people in a racial uplift ideology, and he thought that that would be the key to black people being treated more equally in this country, because we would have enough economic power like other races in this country to not be messed with. Casting down your bucket among my people, helping and encouraging them as you are doing on these grounds, and to education of the head, hand, and heart, you will find that they will buy your surplus land, make blossom the waste places in your fields, and run your factories. While doing this, you can be sure in the future as in the past that you and your families will be surrounded by the most patient, faithful, law-abiding, and unresentful people the world has seen. Booker T. Washington is often presented as the counter to a young W.E.B. Du Bois, as they were two of the most prominent black leaders of the late 19th century. And it's usually presented as if Washington and Du Bois were diametrically opposed in terms of their ideology, and in many ways they were, but I'd argue that from a modern perspective, Washington and Du Bois have both been repurposed to undergird the same ideology of black capitalism and black conservatism. And this is where we get to the main thing I want to get at. What we have now, unlike even back then, is an imbalance on what black political thought is taken seriously and is seriously engaged in our media and our political imagination. We're often taught that Washington and Du Bois were on opposite sides of what black people were doing at the time. Most of you have heard about the Atlanta Compromise, where Booker T. Washington basically said, don't worry about ending segregation or fighting for equal rights under the law. Instead, focus on building internal institutions for power for black people. This was popular among a lot of black elites and, of course, white Southerners. Washington was definitely more accommodating to white supremacy, which is something that has tarnished his legacy. And he did work explicitly behind the scenes to quell and undermine black radical action that Du Bois was trying to undertake. And yes, on the flip side, Du Bois wanted to be more direct in resisting segregation through protests, and this made Du Bois a radical for the time. But in reality, Du Bois was still very much black excellence pilled. By the way, because I know somebody's probably about to do it, it is Du Bois. And if I see one of y'all try to correct me in the comments, it's Du Bois. Moving on. Du Bois was an elitist himself and not completely committed to a more radical or leftist response to racial injustice at this time in his life. So the idea that they were complete opposites is really not accurate. They even wrote a book together in 1907. But Du Bois is the father of American sociology and the most important figure in American leftist thought, black or otherwise. But he didn't start out like this. He started out much more aligned with black elitism, black capitalism, etc., just with a more aggressive view than Washington. And this is in part because Du Bois was a born elite from the Northeast, and Washington was born a slave and knew the realities of white Southerner violence in a way that Du Bois didn't understand. So again, to be gracious to this different ideology, Washington, knowing what white Southerners were capable of, wanted a gradual change, partly because he didn't want people to be killed. But here's the thing. Booker T. Washington died in 1915, and a few years later, Du Bois witnessed the Bolshevik Revolution and began moving much further left and incorporating Marxist ideology into his own. Soon we get Du Bois involved in Pan-Africanism and so on. And it's Du Bois, who lived to be 95 years old, who becomes the most prominent thought leader in Black political thought, being a key but often under-discussed influence on one Martin Luther King. It was because of Du Bois that King read Marx and studied socialism, and after seeing the limitations of even the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, King returned to those ideologies and began moving further left in his final years. I'm repeating stuff I talked about in my first Black Conservatives video, but please understand that King was assassinated in 1968, 5 years after the I Have a Dream speech, because he was becoming more anti-capitalist, more anti-imperialist, and more radical after he made that speech. He was in fact assassinated on his way back to Washington for a second time to argue for reparations. And just a week before his assassination, he was getting into it with Andrew Young about direct resistance to the system and the need for being more anti-capitalist, as recounted in the book Profit of Discontent by Andrew Douglas and Jared Loggins. As Belafonte recalls of the conversation that evening, it was Andrew Young, the future US congressman and ambassador to the United Nations, who unwittingly ratcheted up King's anger. "I don't know, Martin," Young said. "It's not the entire system, it's only part of it, and I think we can fix that." King was having none of it. "I don't need to hear from you, Andy," he clapped back. "You're a capitalist and I'm not. The trouble is that we live in a failed system. Capitalism does not permit an even flow of economic resources. Within this system, a small privileged few are rich beyond conscience, and almost all others are doomed to be poor at some level. That's the way the system works. And since we know that the system will not change the rules, we are going to have to change the system." And yeah, as you read there, that's Andrew Young, who went on to carry King's legacy in some ways, but in no way that represents this anti-capitalist message. And he's not alone in that distortion. The leftist ideology of King and everyone involved with that movement before and after him has been systematically erased from popular history. If you don't have a Black Studies master's degree or watch a bunch of videos that I watch, you probably haven't encountered a lot of this at all. Understand, the civil rights movement at its core was a leftist, anti-capitalist movement that was greatly focused on workers' rights. The first march on Washington started out as a labor and jobs march, and a lot of progress is made because of these actions. And when King and Malcolm were assassinated, the Black Power movement sprung up, and the Panthers sprung up, and they were even more radical, even more dangerous, and even further left. And because of that, the government didn't even bother to engage with them the way they did with King and Malcolm and all the rest of them. They were just jailed, murdered, or exiled. But in the aftermath, the American apparatus recognized that they needed to change up their strategy, that fighting a radicalized Black population was going to be a constantly losing battle. And what they needed to do was buy a lot of us out. And a lot of folks didn't sell out per se, they just bought in. Richard Nixon, good old tricky dick, one of the most evil men to ever be president, which is saying a lot. He explicitly saw value in letting Black people in on the action, getting us away from radical action and moving us toward Black capitalism. A quote from a Time magazine article in 1969 says the following: "As Nixon put it, the government should act decisively to help Negroes gain their fair piece of the action. The rather general idea that Negroes should lift themselves up through business ownership, as many other ethnic groups had done in the US, inspired hope and some votes among people of all races. To the extent that programs of Black capitalism are successful," said Nixon, "the ghettos will gradually disappear." This sounds familiar, doesn't it? It sounds a little bit like Booker T. Washington, and it sounds a lot like popular Black leaders of today. Now, Booker T. Washington, he came first. He was in the 19th century, and for the time, he might have been on to something. Understand, capitalism wasn't the monster it is today at that time. It had not grown to be the engine of inequality that we understand it to be in the 21st century. But by the time we get to Nixon, niggas knew the deal. Hence the resistance to Nixon. And if we knew the deal in 1969 with Nixon, and we had a whole example of the opposite of anti-capitalist strategy being more effective, how the hell is this Black capitalism thing being something that's promoted so ardently by so many folks in 2025? Well, if you're wondering, this is where the most evil president of all time, Satan's favorite himself, Ronald Reagan, this is where he comes in. See, even under Nixon, the whole Black capitalism thing wasn't working. Black folks overall still knew the deal, and not a lot had changed to even make the whole concept viable. But this was also at the tail end of all the efforts and work that the civil rights movement and the Black Power era accomplished. None of those things had fully come into effect yet under Nixon. Affirmative action, set-aside programs, voting rights, anti-discrimination laws, etc. These things didn't hit immediately, but when they did, when they started having true cultural impact, we see an explosion of Black everything from the 70s going into the 80s. Things are looking up and Black people aren't selling out, they're buying in. They're keeping their Black sensibilities, they're keeping their pro-Blackness, and they're getting ahead with it, some of them. There were still tons of racism, tons of barriers, microaggressions. Please never forget that even the Black president in 2008 was subjected to chicken and watermelon and monkey jokes. But to at least this cadre of Black folks that had made it to a certain point, they felt like they had done something, and the next generation of kids, namely Gen Xers and old millennials like myself, we had to stop playing the victim and take things to the next level. And a lot of us did. And suddenly we had a new class of Black elites doing what Black elites always have done. Understand that Black excellence, Black elitism at its core has always been purposefully exclusionary to other Black people. It's why the boule exists. It's why Jack and Jill's exists. It's why the brown paper bag test existed. Again, looking at you, Steph Curry, and your whole entire extended family of light-skinned people, that is not an accident, that is a choice. But what really brings us to where we are right now is, again, Ronald Reagan. Reagan recognized the need to erase the history of what had gotten Black people to these advances in the first place, to take things even further in terms of counterintelligence than Nixon did. And what he did was really slick and effective. First, people don't know that the only reason why we have Martin Luther King's birthday as a federal holiday is because of Ronald Reagan, much to the chagrin of his white peers at the time who didn't see the long game. They didn't see the vision, but boy, Reagan was cooking when he did this shit. And then to double down, a year later, he became the first president to officially recognize Black History Month. And there's an explosion of recognition for it nationwide and a lot of influence on what becomes the official Black History Month curriculum. So instead of being a complete telling of Black history in all its forms in America, we see a renewed focus on figures like Booker T. Washington and Madam C.J. Walker, George Washington Carver, important legendary Black first figures who also just happen to easily undergird the narrative of Black liberation through capitalism. Meanwhile, someone like Nat Turner, Fred Hampton, they didn't make it to my middle school curriculum much, if at all. Ask any Gen X or millennial what they taught you during Black History Month. It's the same handful of people that fit a specific narrative. It's always about Black Americans who contributed to and found ways to flourish in the American dream, not the Black Americans who resisted and fought against American racism as an inner colony. And this is no more apparent than how the legacy of King is bastardized today. Martin Luther King during his time was one of the most hated men in America, but now he's Black Santa Claus to an entire generation of kids because they get to see him do the I Have a Dream speech while they're controlling Spider-Man and playing Fortnite. Yes, that's a real thing. And it's this generation of Black Gen Xers, me and my older brothers and sisters, that had this type of teaching that now are the most influential figures in our media today, telling you that Black capitalism is going to save us and that anyone that questions it is a fool or is repeating something that white liberals made up. It's really bad. But it wouldn't bother me so much if that weren't a complete monopoly of thought, if the resources and attention that these specific figures had was not so completely focused on their specific narrative and all the dissenting opinions were excluded. Again, being gracious, I believe most of these Black folks think they're doing right by Black people. But how would they know if they never actually engage with any of the thinkers to the left of them? You go back to the 60s and 70s and you see constant engagement with the Black left, the Black Panthers, the Black Power movement, even Malcolm X was doing TV interviews. And yes, there were still Black moderates and people talking that Black capitalism shit then, but there was a balance of thought in our media, even if I didn't agree with it. But now the balance is having Amanda Seales argue with 20. And shout out to Amanda Seales, because whatever criticisms you have of Amanda, she is, in my opinion, an anti-capitalist and a leftist, and her politics are good. Check mark for Amanda Seales. But if you wanted this to be an actual valuable engagement with Black political thought, we leave the out of the equation. It would be Amanda Seales versus 20 Black liberals. Jubilee. I will go to that one. Jubilee. Hop back in my DMs. Because once we do that, we're actually engaging in centering Black political thought, not Black political spectacle and counterinsurgency. And look, y'all, these days you haven't noticed, I'm not trying to start no internet fights with no one. I'm not trying to air nobody out. This wasn't even the plan. I was supposed to be talking about Bill Belichick and his fetish for white wide receivers right now in time for football season. And I have been going out of my way recently, to my detriment, in fact, to be amenable and palatable to black liberals and moderates, because I realize that while I may have a big YouTube platform, I'm still a very small drop in the bucket. And the black left and the black radicalism is pretty much the same. There's not enough flow of our ideas into the cultural zeitgeist of black people. And I think that can only be done by having cordial conversations and fair criticism rather than hit pieces. Although I may have one last one I'm working on for later this year. And all of this is why I think we should regard black capitalists and black liberals, no matter how pro-black they are, as conservative if those are the ideologies that they are holding on to. We should stop acting like the Candace Owenses of the world exist. Stop allowing them to be controlled opposition and present themselves as ideologies worthy of our engagement, because they're not. Instead, we need discourse and debate with actual black conservatives so that they can illustrate how this whole black capitalism thing is actually going to work this time around. And once we get past that fallacy, maybe then we can have a real renaissance of black political movement in this country, as we are well past due for it. I'm just a nigga that watches too many cartoons and looks like he works at GameStop. What do I know? I'm FD Signifier, and this has been Light Work.